Hello and welcome to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and this evening I will be doing a review of Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Now this was another one of the books I reread this year. The first time I read this I was 16 years old. If you'd like a bit more information about why I read this, you can see my 27 years of reading video, though fair warning, I don't give out that many details. But in any case, I decided to reread this year, in the spring, I think, and it was a very enjoyable experience. If you're not familiar with the plot of this book, it's basically the story, the fictional memoir of a pedophile. Humbert Humbert writes his story, the story of his relationship with a 12-year-old girl named Dolores Hayes, aka Lolita, from prison. Humbert Humbert is a European literature professor, French literature professor, and he tells the story of his childhood, then his teenage years, then his young adult years, tells of his first marriage, which was dreadful because, well, he's a pedophile and perhaps attracted to just post-pubescent girls, but not fully adult women, basically. And then he gets a job offer in America, or I think now he gets a contract to translate a book. In any case, he gets to the United States. And then he lodges with a woman named Charlotte Hayes, and Charlotte Hayes has a daughter, Lolita, and Humbert Humbert is starstruck, falls madly in love or lust with Lolita, and well, decides I have to stay here, because he actually wasn't really going to stay with Charlotte Hayes, but then he says, oh yeah, no, I'll take the vacancy. And so he lives with them, and then at some point, spoiler alert, Charlotte Hayes dies, which is the golden opportunity Humbert Humbert had been praying for. And then he takes custody of Lolita, and they go on a cross-country journey through the United States in a car. They stay in numerous motels. That lasts for about 6 months to perhaps a year. And then they settle down in a New England town where Humbert Humbert takes a position as a literature professor. Lolita attends a girls' college. By college, I mean like a high school. And then something happens with that so they live in a house, and Humbert freaks out because Lolita's getting close to a female peer, and then she starts seeing boys her age. And there's this weird shadowing by a mysterious figure, a playwright called Claire Quilty, who seems also interested in Lolita, and in whom Lolita seems to also be interested. Humbert freaks out, they leave, and once again go on a car journey through the States, and Humbert ends up losing Lolita, basically. And then I won't go into the ending especially because, I don't want to spoil it too much. But that's the basic story. Now, I do want to preface the rest of the video by saying that if you're concerned about the content of this novel, it's not explicit in any major way. There are no vivid descriptions of sexual acts. This is not pornographic at all. It's not voyeuristic. And that's why I will say this is one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read in the English language to this day. The level of mastery of Vladimir Nabokov in the English language is mind-blowing, especially when you learn that the man was a Russian citizen. I mean, he was a Russian expat. So English wasn't his native language. Russian was, and actually most of his novels were written in Russian. He wrote 2 novels in English, Lolita and Arda, which I've also read, and which is also excellent. So that's really bloody impressive, I think. So it's beautifully written, the descriptions, the ambiance, you feel everything, which, okay, in that respect can be a bit disturbing because you really get into the head of Humbert Humbert. So yeah, if you're uncomfortable with that subject, probably not the best choice. One interesting thing I read about Lolita was that, in a way, it's the love story between the author, Vladimir Nabokov, and the English language. And I can kind of see where those people were coming from, honestly. You can sense he really enjoyed playing with the language, with the words. A lot of word plays, puns, references, allusions to literature, to culture, linguistic idioms, whatever. There's a lot of cheekiness. There is a lot of playfulness, which, again, a bit weird considering the disturbing subject matter. Also, slightly challenging at times. The first time I read this, I did need to use a dictionary a couple of times. Some people might find that annoying. I found it an opportunity to learn new things, personally. Now, this novel is also known to be a brilliant, shining example of the unreliable narrator. Because, yeah, the story is told straight on, for the whole length of it, from the exclusive point of view of Humbert, the predator. And he's really trying his hardest to make you feel sympathetic towards him and to exculpate himself from what he did and to bring you over to his, not his cause, but to, oh, please forgive me, understand this, my childhood, these things happened, they shaped me, and I really tried to be a good person, and etc., etc. And it kind of works, that's the scary thing. I do kind of think this is a love story, or more precisely, it's a passion story. Now, contrary to what many people today might think, passion isn't a good thing. It's a very destructive, toxic thing. In its original sense, passion means suffering. To be fair, it's unrequited love or passion, lust, whatever, right? We're all agreed on that. Lolita does not want to be in this relationship. You can argue that Humbert is a monster, he's a pedophile, he's a pervert, he's a predator. 100% agree with that. But he still loves, cares for, in a way, is obsessed at least, with Lolita. Because, even things like love or passion, or especially passion, but love, even love can be perverted and twisted into something that's just deeply wrong. Or at least that's what I think. So yeah, it's a kind of a unrequited love story or passion story. So who is Humbert? Apart from the epithets pedophile, monster, pervert, what have you. Who is this man whose head you spend the entire story in? Well, he's quite charming. That's also another disturbing element of the novel. I guess some people would call that sociopathic. I'm not really sure that fits, and besides, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'm not going to diagnose him, apart from, the pedophilia, obviously. He's very educated. He's quite intelligent. He's a literature professor. He's extremely well-read. He speaks 2-3 languages, but definitely French and English. He's cultured. He comes from a rich family that had a hotel in the south of France. I mean, he's not that rich, but he comes from money and from the upper old Europe class. Very manipulative. Oh yes, he has a way with words. The author has a way with words, but because of that, well, the character of Humbert has a way with words. He manipulates you. He twists and turns the story to his advantage. It makes you feel sympathetic towards him somewhat. I mean, there are certain points where he goes into the merits of not just age difference relationships, there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's between consenting adults, right? But relationships between, like a 50-year-old and a 12-year-old. He's not 50 himself, but he goes through historical examples that are just taken way out of context. It's like, see, it's not so bad. I'm giving her an education. I'm elevating her out of a middle-class, trashy American surroundings. I mean, at that point, I didn't feel sympathetic towards him at all. I think, if you're a decent person, intelligent enough, you can see through his game, but there are times where inevitably you're gonna fall for his spell just a wee bit. At least it was my case, but I think it's been the case of a lot of readers, and that's the point. Because what is he doing exactly with this memoir? He's preparing this for his trial, right? I mean, then he dies before the trial actually takes place, but he wants to appeal to his potential readers. Several times he says, "Dear ladies and gentlemen of the jury." That's how he starts in a lot of his chapters. He really wants to convince you that what he did was bad, yes, but I'm repenting, and there were mitigating circumstances, and I fell in love with this girl when I was 13 years old, and that crystallized my desire, my sexual attraction patterns, which made it so that I couldn't find adult women attractive or alluring. And he goes into this theorizing about nymphets and faunlets and nympholepts and all that stuff. He really does his hardest, to just convince you that he's not such a monster. But yeah, there are cracks though. And then you have, obviously, Dolores Hayes. So everything I'm about to say, Keep in mind that, once again, she's described from the point of view of Humbert Humbert. You don't really ever know what she's truly like as a person. The way she's presented is as a stereotypical pubescent girl teenager with very vapid interests. She's fascinated by Hollywood film stars and clothes and having the latest soda pops and candies and dresses. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention this takes place in the late 50s, so keep that in mind, the historical context. So all these things of the American dream, and she appears to be very superficial. There's not much to her that's terribly likable, or at least for someone like me. Like, she's the polar opposite of my personality, even when I was her age. She wants to spend time with her female friends and talk about boys and talk about actors, etc., etc. So she's presented as, this is going to sound terrible, but a young vapid twit, basically. But beautiful and alluring and sexually alluring, according to Humbert Humbert, the unreliable narrator. I can't stress this enough. But then you see the cracks. You do manage to see the cracks. Her mother, which I will come to in a minute, isn't very nice to her, with her. I think she has a piss poor relationship with her mum, which doesn't help psychologically, obviously. There is no father figure. Overall, I don't think she's being well taken care of as a child, as a developing young person. And even Humbert Humbert recognizes, there's like a moment of radical, shattering self-awareness where he says, but you know, I recall this memory of her trying to talk about a theatre play she had read at school, or a book she had read at school, and what it had made her think. And she says something fairly profound. I can't remember what it is, unfortunately. And he kind of realizes that I haven't seen her for the human being she is. I've just molded her into this idealized creature, this nymphette, this modern incarnation of his lost childhood love, Annabelle. And that was, how can I say this? It was heart-rending, really. So sad and tragic in a way. And there's this scene that's forever engraven in my mind. So her mum dies, and she goes on this road trip with her abuser. They stay in a motel room, and then Humbert Humbert, quite coldly I might add, because he describes her as an ice queen, and she's so difficult and temperamental, and she never wants to be affectionate with him anymore, because she was affectionate when he was with her mum. She was playful with him, you know, but an adult should recognize that it's natural for young people to have these growing sexual impulses, but, you know, keep them in check. Of course, he feeds into it, right? And then she becomes cold, and she doesn't want to be touchy-feely with him and have sex with him, basically. And then he describes her crying her eyes out in the adjoining motel room because her mum's just died. She's alone in the world, and she's stuck with this predator. I can't imagine the despair that must induce in someone. I mean, in sadly, a lot of young girls or even boys that have gone through horrific experiences like that. That was also a heart-rending, gut-wrenching moment. So yeah, you do see the cracks. That's the tragedy, and yeah, I'm going to say beautiful tragedy of this novel, because like I've said in another video, darkness, hard subjects can be beautiful in a way, or they can be explored beautifully, if that makes sense. And like I said, a quick mention of her mother, Charlotte Hayes. I mean, she's not present in much of the novel, ultimately. But I think that was also a major problem, is that her mother was a terrible parent, actually. Let's be honest about it. Dolores Hayes is a pretty saccharine, overly romantic, middle-aged woman who falls madly in love with Humbert Humbert, and she's so impressed and awestruck by his culture, his education, his knowledge of books, and the fact he's a European gentleman. And she's so mean and annoyed and petty towards her daughter. Now, I'm not a parent. I don't know what it's like to raise a young teenager. I'm sure it's very hard. She's not a good mother. I'm sorry. The way she treats her kid, she just wants to ship her off to boarding school so she can have her idyll with Humbert Humbert, who's actually a monster. And even in the end, when she discovers he is a monster, her first concern isn't for her child and the potential danger she's in. It's for her own broken heart, her betrayed trust, and her bruised emotions. And I'm like, oh, screw you! No, I didn't feel any sympathy whatsoever for her. Ultimately, she shouldn't have been killed off, because then, well, Lolita's all alone, but still, gosh, she was an annoying character. Though, again, that's how Humbert Humbert describes her, so ultimately, who really knows what she was truly like, right? And finally, a quick note about the shadowy figure I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Claire Quilty, a playwright. Now, he's supposed to be a fellow pedophile, a really creepy one, a very clever one, who follows Humbert and Lolita around the country because he's going to take Lolita away from Humbert, and Lolita's supposedly okay with this because she actually fancies Claire Quilty. She supposedly had posters of him in her bedroom. But see, I read something about the ending, which I shall discuss very shortly, that kind of puts everything into question regarding that character. Theme-wise, one thing I did read about, which influenced what I'm about to say, because I read it through that lens somewhat, because you know that in all these Penguin Classics editions, you have introductions that kind of talk about the history of the book, so obviously that kind of colors your reading of it, I think. But it's true that one of the themes, or the seeming themes of this novel, which isn't immediately apparent, apart from it's a story about a pedophile and his victim. Okay, yeah, that's obvious, but Nabokov was, I think, a greater writer than that. I've read that this is kind of a reflection on old European society versus the emerging, newer, more modern society of the United States, with its consumerism, neoliberal capitalism, artificiality, I guess, and both those entities are represented by the two main characters. Humbert for old Europe, and Lolita for new America, the United States. And yeah, I could kind of see that. And that's a really interesting way of analysing the novel, I think. The question is, is old Europe perverting America? Because at the time, a lot of books such as this one were banned in the United States, but you could get them through a French publishing house called Olympus Press, and they published Lolita, I think they published Henry Miller's works, they published Lady Chatterley's Lover, which I've also talked about. So there was a sense of sensual sexual freedom and freedom of morals and thought that you could find, like, old Europe, France, that area, especially specifically France actually, that you couldn't find in the United States. So there's this question of is old Europe perverting young America because Humbert is perverting young Lolita? Or conversely, is it new America with her fast food, her Hollywood celebrities, her drugstores with soda pops and candies and clothes and artificial things? Because there's Humbert hates all of it. He hates America, basically, and all the artificiality of it, the plastic nature of everything. Lolita loves going through all these little towns with like, oh, we have the biggest bowl of yarn here, or we have the biggest wheel of cheese, or stuff like that, or this completely tacky fake Native American ceremony you could watch. And he hates all of it. He rips it to shreds and criticizes it all the time, and he feels soiled by all of it. So is Lolita, America, soiling the sensibilities, the history, the art, the refinement, if you can call it that, of old Europe? So there's this kind of dynamic interplay between these two characters as stand-ins for these two gigantic cultural entities. And I thought that was really interesting. And then, well, it's a very psychological novel. There aren't any, apart from that big one, or the theme of... But even then, child abuse, is it really a theme he was going for in and of itself? I'm not sure. He used it kind of as a motif to explore something else, I guess. Yeah, it's just a psychological tale. It's a melancholy, tragic tale of child abuse, of unrequited, toxic, twisted, perverted passion. There aren't any overarching social themes apart from America versus Europe that I could really point to. Though that didn't bother me, it's still one of the greatest novels I've ever read. Because there is something very tragic and sad about it. It's sad because you have Lolita being abused, but everything. You're in Humbert's head, and he's a sad character. He's a disgusting, perverted character, but he's also sad and pathetic in a way. There's something truly pathetic about his obsession with Lolita and young girls. Yeah, monsters can be pathetic and inspire kind of weird, twisted pity in a way. It's like the color I associate in my mind with this novel is grey. The grey of an overcast sky, heavy with rain, but the rain will just not fall and cleanse anything. That's really the impression this novel left me, this deep melancholia and tragedy of the story. It's quite heavy stuff. This is not a light read, this is not an uplifting read or a cheerful read by any means, but it's a gem of the English language literature repertoire, I think. And a quick note about the ending, like I said. I kept it for the end of my video because, well, I'm gonna spoil some of the plot, so if you don't want to know anything, I'll see you later. The way the novel ends, Lolita goes away with this Claire Quilty figure, and Humbert goes after them, but ultimately loses them. A couple years later, he's living on his own, and then he meets a young woman and he shacks up with her for some reason. Then he gets a letter in the mail from Lolita. Oh yeah, one thing I forgot to mention, that was really sick and perverted. She calls him Dad because he says, when we're in public, when we're going to the motels, we're going to pass as father and daughter, right? So she calls him, Dear Dad, I have married. I'm expecting a child and we need money to move to Alaska because her husband has found a promising job. Could you please send the money in letter? But then there's an address on that letter and Humbert says, I'm going to go and find her. And he goes to this little rundown town, pretty poor, obviously, and he sees her, and she's 18. She has a huge swollen belly from pregnancy, and this really disturbs him deeply. Now, he sees her as aged and weathered by time, and I'm like, dude, she's 18 years old. I mean, you gotta remember, he's a pedophile, so obviously he sees her as old at 18, right? But he does still feel a fondness for her, and in a weird plea of desperation, he asks her, come with me to the car and we'll drive away from here and we'll start fresh, we'll start a new life together and I will take good care of you, etc, etc. Like, you can almost feel he's on the cusp of redeeming himself, that he will actually treat her decently and not abuse her, though I guess ultimately that's pretty doubtful. And she says, no, I was never into you, I never loved you, I always had a thing for Claire Quilty, the man she left with. And then she starts explaining that she lived with him for a while, and the guy was even more creepy and perverted than Humbert. He had a mansion where he would hold sex parties with several teenagers and young people and film pornographic movies with them. And he wanted her to be in movies and do lots of creepy sex things with various strangers. And she hightailed it out of there, became a waitress or something, and then met her current husband. That was weird. And so she says, no, I'm not going to go with you. This is goodbye, but thank you for the money. And he leaves and he's in tears. He's completely shattered and regrets everything he did to her and the way he treated her, and it's quite melodramatic. And he goes to seek this Claire Quilty. He finds him in a sprawling manor house out in the country, and to make a long story short, they have this confrontation and he accuses him of all the worst evils. But then Claire Quilty says, oh, but I can find you girls, I can find you 10-year-olds, and I can find you pedophilic porn, and he tries to convince him that he can get him sweet deals with like young girls and stuff like that, really creepy, disgusting stuff. Also, Humbert won't shoot him because in the meantime he's acquired a gun. And so Humbert actually kills Claire Quilty, drives away, drives to a cliffside or something, and then he ends up being caught by the police, alright? So he wanted to redeem himself by killing the even worse pervert. And then, when I finished this novel, I went to read some reviews. I usually do this. And I read that actually, that ending might be complete fabulation. And that was a fantasy of Humbert. That actually Lolita died much earlier in the story from some kind of really bad flu. And that she never got to the age of 18, she never got pregnant, she never gave birth to a stillborn baby girl. There never was a Claire Quilty, and he was never killed by Humbert. But that Claire Quilty was actually a projection, an incarnation, a coalescing of Humbert perversion, evilness, monstrosity, pedophilia itself. And that by killing it, he killed that part of himself to redeem himself, in his mind at least. So that was like, what? That is a mindfuck. Because apparently the dates from the time he starts writing his memoir in prison and the dates he gives throughout the narrative of when Lolita gets taken away by Claire Quilty, apparently nothing adds up. So all of that apparently is a fabrication of his mind. But he did end up in prison somehow. And I saw a couple of articles, academic papers on this, and I kind of buy that version. I think that's a much more interesting analysis of the story than the one I previously assumed was canon, I guess. And I enjoyed that. So that's one of the great aspects of me rereading this year. And now I will read out some quotes from Lolita. Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul, Lolita. The tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth. Lolita. As I looked on through prismatic layers of light, dry-lipped, focusing my lust and rocking slightly under my newspaper, I felt that my perception of her, if properly concentrated upon, might be sufficient to have me attain a beggar's bliss immediately. Then she crept into my waiting arms, radiant, relaxed, caressing me with her tender, mysterious, impure, indifferent, twilight eyes, for all the world like the cheapest of cheap cuties. For that is what nymphets imitate, while we moan and die. The gentle and dreamy regions through which I crept were the patrimonies of poets, not crime's prowling ground. Despite our tiffs, despite her nastiness, despite all the fuss and faces she made, and the vulgarity, and the danger, and the horrible hopelessness of it all, I still dwelled deep in my elected paradise. A paradise whose skies were the colour of hell flames, but still a paradise. Our long journey had only defiled with a sinuous trail of slime the lovely, trustful, dreamy, enormous country that by then, in retrospect, was no more to us than a collection of dog-eared maps, ruined tour books, old tires, and her sobs in the night, every night, the moment I feigned sleep. I could not kill her, of course, as some have thought. You see, I loved her. It was love at first sight, at last sight, at ever and ever sight. What I used to pamper among the tangled vines of my heart, mon grand péché radieux, had dwindled to its essence. Sterile and selfish vice, all that I cancelled and cursed. She groped for words. I supplied them mentally. He broke my heart. You merely broke my life. I'm thinking of aurochs and angels, the secret of durable pigments, prophetic sonnets, the refuge of art. And this is the only immortality you and I may share, my Lolita. And that was my review of Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Definitely not an easy book to read, and like I said, I can understand why many people wouldn't want to read that novel. I do get annoyed when people mischaracterize it and think it's torture porn or that it glorifies pedophilia, which it most certainly does not. But if it's just a question of I can't handle these types of subjects, I completely respect that. But to me, it's, like I said, it's one of the best books I've ever read, or at least it's one of the most important books I've read in my life, among many others, mind you, but yeah, I had to do a review of it for this channel. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the review. Hope you found it interesting. If you've read the novel, please do share your thoughts about it. In the meantime, I hope you all have a lovely day or evening, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye-bye.